Welcome to Health Tech Heroes, where we talk to innovators who are rewriting the DNA of healthcare. We have an exciting guest today. From transforming pharmaceutical giants to becoming one of the 50 greatest salespeople of all time, our guest today is a legend in healthcare sales, Jerry Acuff, CEO of Delta Point and Wall Street Journal bestselling author, has spent 4 decades mastering the art of relationship-based selling in healthcare. His game-changing approaches have helped countless organizations successfully navigate the complex healthcare marketplace. Today, Jerry Acuff, the Dale Carnegie of 21st century, will share his powerful insights on what it really takes to succeed in health tech. Jerry, welcome to Health Tech Heroes.
Thank you for having me, Fasa. I really look forward to this.
And I really appreciate your time. As our first question, what drove you from a military background to transition to pharma sales and to founding Delta Point? What's your origin story, Jerry?
Well, it's probably not what you would think. I went to college in the Virginia Military Institute on a football scholarship, and I wanted to be a college football coach. I could not get into coaching, and one of my roommates from VMI calls me and asked me if I wanted to get a job in the pharmaceutical business. And I was teaching at a Stanton Military Academy, which was back then an all-boys school, and that's closed up now. But I'm actually going there this Saturday, because they want me, because I was one of their coaches, to see them at their reunion. Anyway, I said, Mike, nobody's going to hire me. I said, I have no science background, none. I said, I was on academic probation every semester, except the first and the last. I graduated with a 2.18 GPA. And I said, whoever I'm going to be interviewing, he'd be nuts to hire me. She's, this guy likes athletes. So I go meet with the guy. His name is Jim Crutchfield. God rest, he's still alive, and he's one of my favorite people in the world. And he hired me. And I was like, really? Now, I had sold Lipton tea in Jackson, Tennessee. And honestly, I could sit in a car in front of a grocery store in West Tennessee, and I could not get out of the car. I had such call reluctance. And so, but then when I got into pharmaceutical, I said, I can't say no to this. I can't get into college coaching. I got to find a job. And I guess, Wayne Dyer said, in his book, he said, you must manage the coincidences in your life, and there are none. And so there was no coincidence that I met Jim Crutchfield, who was the guy who hired me. And he gave me a territory in Charlottesville, Virginia, and it was the worst territory in the country. And I was frustrated for several years because he taught me very early on. One thing, I had to ride with a rep before I got hired, and the guy's name was Gary Crumpler. God rest his soul, he's gone. But I asked him, I said, what about these doctors? I said, I'm scared to talk to these doctors. He said, don't be scared to him. He said, these ain't God. They're just like you and me. So stop worrying about that. And I mean, that had a gigantic impact on me, because I felt like, if I really had something to say, I could do it. I wouldn't have to be worried about it. So I was a rep for 6 years. I got promoted to district manager in Birmingham. We had 55 districts. I had the number one district 7 out of 8 years. Hired 20 people in 8 years. I fired one guy after 3 weeks. And that was the first one I hired. And then the rest of them, which would be 19 people, all of them within 2 years were in the top 50 in the country. 7 were the number one rep in the country, and 13 of those people got promoted. And so then I went to the home office. But I'll tell you why I went to the home office. By then I had another boss. His name was Don Cutcliffe, and God rest his soul, he died about last year. And he changed my life in every conceivable way. And almost anybody who thinks they have talent, but they're not sure, they should read Ron Williham's book. And there's only one chapter in it that's any good. It's The People Principle, and you can buy it on Amazon. But in there, he talks about the 3 dimensions of human performance. And one of them is, how do we think of ourselves? Now, I grew up in a situation where my parents were married 9 times between them. I had virtually no supervision. My mother was an alcoholic for 30 years, but I had great coaches for athletics. And those people really changed my life. But anyway, I go to work for him, and my goal, and this is my mindset, I want to be a regional manager. Now, a regional manager in the pharmaceutical business has about 100 to 150 people, probably makes $150,000 a year. And I'm saying, if I could get that job, oh my gosh, I'd love that. So, but I got a new boss, and he and I had been in the same area, and he was 10 years older than me. And this man changed my life in 2 minutes. He comes to see me in 2 minutes. Here's what he said to me. He said, look, he lived in Tampa and I was in Birmingham, but he grew up in Birmingham. So the day he got promoted, he called me and he said, hey, I want to go to dinner with you tonight. And I said, you're going to fly up here? He said, yep. I said, well, what time do you want us there? He said, your wife is not invited. This is between you and me. So, all right. So I'm thinking, is he going to fire me? I mean, I'm the top guy in the country. And so when I get to the Jolly Ox in Birmingham, he comes in, he says, Jerry, I came here to tell you two things. One, you should have got this job, not me. He said, you are far more qualified to do this than I am, but they didn't give it to you. They gave it to me. I'm not giving it back. And then he said this to me, Fonz. He said, but this job is not big enough for you. You need to be running our company. And I promise you tonight, I will not stop advocating on your behalf until you're running this company. Now you're talking about a $600 million company with 1,000, people. And literally in 4.5 years, I was running the company. But you see what he did, he changed my view of what I was capable of. And that's why, and if you read that book, it talks about the 3 dimensions of human performance. My belief in myself was smaller than what my possibility was. So one of the things that I always tried to do as a leader is to make sure that people are working to their potential, because so many are not. And so I learned that lesson from him. I cried like a baby when he died, and I was his boss, 2 or 3 times over in 4.5 years. But he was an inveterate reader. He read all the time. I've read 660 business books since 1981, and I learned a lot of that from him. But I think the real thing is we have to have people that can help us succeed. Nobody succeeds alone. So that's how I wound up in the pharmaceutical business. Then I went to work with a friend of mine. He fired me after 2 years because he didn't like the fact that I disagreed with him. And I said, well, you were wrong. He said, well, I got to fire you. And that's when I decided, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do. And so I started thinking about it. I said, well, I have a great network. And I hadn't written my first book, but I had a great network. I just, when I was unemployed, I went and I went back to Jersey because I was living in Scottsdale, and I'd fly up there every now and again. And I had lunch with a guy that I had hired years ago, and he had a big job at one of the big pharma companies. And he said, hey, I need you to help me. That was my first project. And then the next project was I asked him a question. I said, he was at a meeting. He was a marketing guy. I said, what have you learned from your very best people that you've translated across your organization for everybody else? And the moment I said that, he jumped up out of his desk and he said, you can do that. He said, you taught us how to do that. He said, send me a proposal. So I sent him a proposal. I said, I'll go work with your reps. All I did, Foss, was do the same thing I did when I was a district manager. I go ride with them. I'd learn the product, and then I would say, okay, if I were y'all, I would do this. So like the first project that I ever did big time was with Rupp product, and I launched that product, and their goal was a market share of 28. They had 0, and it was 28. At the end of the first year, I had them at 52. And when I left, they were at 72, and I quit because I said, you guys got more business than you deserve. 70% of the patients who had hepatitis have, a whole lot of, whatever you have in there. And then, but if you don't have that much, which is 30% of the population, you don't need a heavy duty thing. You need the other product. I said, you guys are getting business you don't deserve, and I can't do that.
Even though we don't have the Hippocratic oath, but we are responsible for doing the right things. How can the health tech companies apply your relationship edge philosophy when selling disruptive technologies?
I think it's a great question. I tell you, one company hired me to train their MSLs. They were launching the product, and so the first question I asked them, now I have a degree in English, so I'm not no scientist at all. But I asked the question, there were 50 people in the room, and I had been hired by the president of the company to come and talk to the MSLs, because as well as I do, MSLs are about the most important people and they can go and have conversations with physicians that make them think. So I think the biggest thing that I discovered was I asked this first question, and I said, look, let me ask you a question. You're an MSL. Tell me what you do for a living. And this was a woman who was, I think, from somewhere in Europe. And she said, we disseminate information. And my response was, you do know we can do that with a postcard. I said, your job is to make people think differently. And you cannot do that until you know what they currently think. Now, so to me, the critical successes are, number one, be a very good listener and don't be ready to preach. Be ready to learn. Be ready. I mean, I remember when I was working with Roche and they had launched a product, and I asked a Mayo Clinic trained physician, what do you think of this product? And he said, well, it's just, this was a pill for women with cancer. And it was a pill. Historically, people get 5FU. He said, well, it's just oral 5FU. My response was, what if that weren't the case? Now, I think if I'm an MSL, I want to learn how to use that phrase a lot, because a lot of times what the customer is telling us is not exactly what we would like for them to think. And we probably know more about it than they do. Now, we don't want to lord it over them, but we want to be able to get into a discussion. So I asked this doctor, I said, what do you think of this product? He said, well, it's just oral 5FU. And I said, well, what if that weren't the case? He said, you mean it isn't? I said, well, why don't you let me explain what I know, and then you tell me whether you still think that way. So I told him, I said, the differences between these two products, one of these goes all over your body. The other one is tumor specific. And if you look at the studies, and I had read all the studies show that if you give this product, which is not 5FU, it actually is more effective than when you give them 5FU. And his response was, well, that's not oral 5FU at all. So I think a lot of it, we have to be really good at trying to understand exactly what the customer is saying. And you can't do that by being in a hurry to tell them about how great your product is. When I went to my doctor and asked him, how many reps come here? 100. How many are any good? 2. Well, that means to me that 2 people are actually listening. They're actually trying to figure out, is there some way that I can offer something here? And sometimes the differences are not big. They're not big. But I mean, one of the things that I always do if I'm working with a client is I learn their product. I read that package insert from head to stern. And I want to find out, are there any differences between this product and the other? Now, I know I can't talk about the other product because that's not my job. However, I probably can ask a question that will get them to think about this thing differently. So I think the biggest thing that we need to do is we need to have people that are far more interested in listening to try and understand, how does the customer currently think? Because you can't change what somebody thinks until you know what they think. And if you ask me, and I think this is true of MSLs far less than it is with sales reps, but you're still going to have a lot of people that they want to lecture to somebody because they got all this knowledge up here. And in reality, I want to try and understand what because sometimes, and I'll give you another example. When we just launched a product called Clafrin, it was a cefotaxime sodium. It was a product for people with bad infections. So my rep calls me about 2 months into the launch of the product, and she said, we got to go see this doctor tomorrow morning at 9:00. Okay. Now, I don't know anything about him. I know he's got 17 other physicians in his practice. And when we got there, he was raving mad. So we walk in and I said, well, why did you want us to come today, Doc? And he said, I want you to know that I'm writing a letter to the Food Administration to have your product removed from the market. Now, how do you respond to that? Now, I'm going to tell you and your listeners a phrase that they need to learn, because when anybody says something to you and you don't understand what the heck they're saying, always say something like this: you have me at a competitive disadvantage. So I asked this doctor who's in charge of 17, I said, you have me at a competitive disadvantage. The person will always say, what do you mean? And I will say, I have no idea why you said what you said. Now, his response was, I put 5 people on your drug and 4 of them died. Now, what's the next question? The next question to me was the breaker. I said, well, when you're sitting at the nurse's station and you're trying to make the decision of what product to put them on, at that moment in time, how many did you think would die? Now, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm trying to understand what he was dealing with. And here's what he said to me. I thought they'd all die. And I said, so wait a minute, would you say that again? And he said it, but he said it with a lower tone. He said, I thought they'd all die. And I said, well, look, the reality is you have to report this, because anytime you have a death with a product, you have to report it. I said, but when you're sitting there and you actually know that you have a patient alive today because you had the foresight to put them on that drug, one of the things that you might want to think about, and maybe I'm overstepping my bounds, but when these people get that low sick, you might want to start thinking about using the product a little bit earlier. And from that point on, the guy became the biggest user we ever had. But my point is, had he said, I didn't think any of them would die, I got to help him get it off the market. But I can't do any of that if I'm not smart enough to ask a question to understand what the heck happened.
And so this is the part of the relationship edge you're talking about.
I want to know what they're thinking before I can respond. I mean, I'll give you another example. You know who Gerald Mandel was? He wrote Principles of Infectious Disease, UVA, and this is 40 years ago. So my boss told me I need to go meet this guy because he was the big guru in infectious diseases at UVA, and UVA was one of my clients. So I walk in there and I show him my card, and he looks at me with a scowl and he says, I hate your company. So what did I say? I said, you have me at a competitive disadvantage. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I have no idea why you said it. He said, your company has never done a drug study. My response was, have they ever asked you? He said, yeah, they did. And I said, well, why are you mad at me? He said, well, I probably shouldn't be. So my point is, and this is, I think is, I mean, and we can laugh about all this stuff because all these things are real. But what I learned from this is that we have to be great listeners. We have to be listening to say, do I truly understand exactly what's going on here? Because what most people do, if they're in the business of communicating, whether it's sales or whether it's in MSL or even whether it's a doctor, they're trying to be expeditious. They're trying to be right, but they also have limited capacity because there's so much stuff in their head. And so if we can't figure out the kinds of things that they're thinking, we're never going to make a positive impact. When I was running a drug company, and I'll tell you this last story, and you probably could throw me off, but I get a call one day and they were telling the physician at a hospital in Pittsburgh that the brain surgeons were using our product before the surgery. It wasn't indicated for that. So he said, is there any way that you could send somebody over here to help me get these doctors to stop doing this? I said, can you get all of them in a room? He said, yeah. And I said, I'll fly over there and tell them exactly they shouldn't be doing it. I said, now, I was very candid. I said, look, the bottom line is, I got a degree in English, but what I did before I came here, and I'm in charge of the company, by the way. So if I ask you to stop using our product, I'm asking you because I believe that that's what you ought to do. But I went to meet with our medical group to find out, are these people doing something that they shouldn't be doing? And they did. So I said, look, I came here to ask you, and you do whatever you want. You're a doctor and I'm a redneck from Memphis. But I will tell you that that's not the place that this product does good. And I said, what bothers me more than that is that if by chance this powerful drug starts to become resistant to bacteria, then everybody's going to have a problem. So I'm here as the person in charge of this company asking you to not use it. And so my bias is I'm not interested in the money. I mean, certainly we all like money, but I'm interested in doing what's right by people, period.
Yeah, especially when it comes down to healthcare, it got to be 100%. There is no margin. Even though our job is selling, we will refuse to sell if you don't think it is the best thing for you.
That's why I say the less you care about the sale, the more you sell. You sell to people who actually have discovered that your product or process can help them. But they come to that conclusion, not us. Yes, but sometimes they don't see the need because they haven't thought of it that way. In my mind, our job is to help people think. Now, once they think, we're either going to find out whether we're wasting our time or we're going to find out that maybe there's a pony here. There's some place this person hasn't thought of. But too many people talk when what they ought to be doing is listening, really trying to understand what is this person thinking and how can I. And when I work with sales reps, I try and teach this to people. We were in Miami and we were talking to a Cuban doctor down there, and the rep begged this guy to see her for 2 minutes. And he kept saying, no, 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 no. And I guess he thought I was her grandfather or something, and he got nice. So she gives him a 2-minute spiel. And I can tell he's just mad as a hornet because he doesn't want to do it. And so when he got ready to leave, I said, say, Doc, can I ask you a personal question? Now, if you say that to any doctor, they'll all say, yeah, what do you want to know? Because all of us have an invisible tattoo on our chest that says, make me feel important. So we were in Little Cuba. And so I asked him, I said, say, can I ask you this personal question? They all say yes. And I said, are you from Philadelphia? Now understand, I'm in Miami, in Little Havana. And I'm asking him, are you, and he's Cuban. He said, how do you know that? And I said, well, there's a picture of you over there, a picture on you in Veterans Stadium. I can't imagine you'd let anybody take a picture if you weren't an Eagles fan. He talked to me, Fasa, for 20 minutes. He told me 12 things that the rep never knew. But I said, look, the reality is I want them to want to have a conversation with me. And there's a really interesting book called Hook Point, and I'm about to tell you everything you need to know. It's not a terrific book, but he's got one idea in there that I think is incredible. He says we need to practice, especially when you're meeting people for the first time, pattern interruption that makes the person want to learn more. So when I go in and I'm trying to see somebody in an office, here's what I will say. Can we do something different today? Now, that always engenders a response that says, yeah, what do you want to do? Here's what I say next. I don't want to sell you anything. Now, when I say I don't want to sell you anything, what happens to sales resistance? It's gone. Now, then it's fair game for me to say, if you were me, and you were responsible for talking to these people these are the people at the front desk. All I want to know today is if you were me, what would you advise me to do so I could be an asset here? And that's the only question I'm going to ask you today. I don't want to see the doctor. I'm probably not going to want to see him next time because I'm not going to get the information that I need, but I am very interested in learning what you want from me. And what you find is that what happens with my doctor, there's only 2 people that are great. Now maybe it's 20. It's still not the vast majority of people that are out doing what we're doing, whether that's a medical device, whether that's a physician. And by the way, your best physicians are usually your best communicators because they can explain it to somebody and they can make it so that they understand. I mean, I have a friend right now that's in the ICU in Birmingham, and I'm talking to his wife every day. He's the first person I ever hired. He's one of the most wonderful people I've ever known. But he's in a hospital where they tell you exactly what they're going to do and when they're going to do it next and all this stuff. But they're great communicators. So I think, what we need to do is to be better listeners, better communicators, and be willing to say, we can't help you or we can help you, but it's still your decision.
That's fantastic. It's kind of twisted my thought process a little bit in a good way. I think now you have allowed your client or the doctor to help you. So it's a masterclass right here. You are asking them, but what did you want? What do you need from me?
But if you do it that way, Fasa, you wind up 20 years down the road with a whole lot of really good friends that are doctors because they know you're different. When I was doing a project for a big company and we were creating their sales model and their coaching model, and they hired a guy to ask doctors what makes the best rep the best rep. And I was interested in that because I was creating the coaching model. So I called the guy and he told me, he said, look, we interviewed 2,000 people. And 60% of the responses, which would have been 1,200, had the exact same 2-word message. They're different. They're different. They don't sound like everybody else. And you go and look and see that now that's 60% of the doctors. Now you can imagine what it is if you just ask a doctor, that was in practice or you really interested from these people? The answer will be, yeah, for the 2 that really know what they're doing. Now maybe it's 20. But it's not the number of large numbers I'd like to see it.
Then once people start doing something similar, then you have to re-innovate. And this is like, I'm sure you have progressed and you have been on a journey where you have re-innovated yourself multiple times. So this kind of brings to the next question that I have in mind. Startup industry is really crowded at this point of time. And I think everybody who's starting a health tech startup wants to stand out. What would be your one key advice for people who are getting started in this crowded market? Jerry, how do you think, what is that key for them to stand out?
Well, I think the key is to first, if I'm just saying, okay, what do I do before I get started? The first thing I would do is I would make a list of all the people that know me well and that I feel like I can go to them and seek their advice about how they would typically approach whatever this product is. We do reasonable business with medical devices. And, basically what we try and teach them is exactly what I said. You can't know what somebody thinks until you ask them what they think. The vast majority of us want to go tell people what we have and why it's the greatest thing since canned beer. I think the other thing is you've got to be willing to ask other people for help to meet other folks. In my book, The Relationship Edge in Business, I have a whole chapter on what is the wording that you use to get someone to introduce you to somebody else. So, for example, Carol Dweck was a great author. She wrote a great book. Stanford, why she'd want to talk to me, I don't know. So I called her office one day because I loved her book and I wanted to tell her that. So I called her in her office, said, she doesn't talk to people like you. And they weren't not nice. They were just saying that this is her policy. But if you send her an email and she likes to talk to you, she will. Now, I spent probably an hour figuring out what am I going to say to her that would make her want to. And what I finally figured out was, the guru for, language is a guy named from Arizona State. And he's the best. And if you read his book, he tells you exactly the kinds of things that you say. Well, I sent her a message and I said, look, I love your book. And I said, I actually think that you uncovered something that this other author did not discover. And if you want to talk, I'd love to tell you. How long do you think it took her to call me? Very shortly. My point is, and my son is going through something similar to this, Fossa. He owns vending machines. So he goes into buildings and he talks to people, etc. And so he asked me, he says, well, how do you get these people to want to talk to you? I said, you have to make yourself memorable. And I said, I don't mean goofy. I mean, why don't you take the receptionist to, $5 cake and do that once every 3 weeks? She'll get you in. And I said, but look, in my book, I always talk about unexpected, thoughtful acts. So, for example, I look for things that people say. I might say to somebody, or somebody might say, my husband and I are going to Las Vegas, or we're going to go to New Orleans on our 25th wedding anniversary. Now, the average person will do nothing with that information. Now, what I'll do is I'll go home that night. I'll call the concierge at the biggest hotel in New Orleans, and I'm going to say, do me a favor. Give me the name of 2 or 3 restaurants that this person would never go to because they don't know anything about New Orleans. I don't want one of these restaurants where it's, everybody else goes. And then, so they all give me, 2 or 3. And I say, God, then I go back maybe the next day or the next week. I say, the last time you were here, you were telling me that you and your husband were going to go. I said, I actually called the Ritz-Carlton and I spoke to their concierge and they gave me these names of restaurants. If you get a chance, you might want to try them. Now, I don't know whether they're going to try them or not. But here's the other thing. In our business, we cannot give people anything but knowledge. We can't give them a paper clip, but I can damn sure give them a restaurant suggestion. And all I have to do is to do something different. So it's not that difficult. My daughter, when she was 14 or 15, she was just stone in love with this TV star. He was a good-looking young kid. And so I had a consultant at that point in time, and I was telling her, she asked me what Laura wanted. And I said, oh, she's crazy about this TV show. She said, well, do you know that star of that show is my son? I said, really? So I went home and told Laura, I said, Valerie's son. And she said, oh, you're kidding. Thanksgiving Day, she rings my phone. I was living in New Jersey, and it's her. And I'm thinking, why are you calling me on Sunday? It's Thanksgiving. She said, well, no, it's Thursday. She said, well, is Laura there? And I said, yes. She said, put her on the phone. So where's her son? It's Thanksgiving. He's at home. So the next thing I hear is Laura screaming at me. The lop of her lungs because she talked to this guy for like 20 minutes. But my point is, this was 30 years ago. I never forget that. So I think part of it is we have to be, I don't mean gratuitous, but I think we have to really think about what could we do so that someone would think that we're different. I mean, if you go back to what that study that I told you about, the 2 words were they're different. 60% of the doctors said they're different. When I'm saying to myself, well, how different are you? Because they're obviously doing the same thing. They're being nice. They're treating people nice. I don't know what they're doing, but that's exactly what Valerie did for me. So I think a lot of it is if you want to get the person to listen, give them a reason to want to listen to what you have to say. So you can start out with, can we do something different? I don't want to sell you anything today. I'd love to get your opinion. I was talking to somebody the other day and they gave me an idea and I'd love to run it by you. Is that okay? I mean, people have this invisible chest tattoo that says, make me feel important. And when you make people feel important, they're far more likely to listen to you.
Yeah, so this is kind of edged in my mind, the whole scene, what happened, and I'm sure that's probably one of the best gifts that he received from you. I'm sure there are other great gifts, but it's just one of the best gifts at that age that somebody took care. And it is remarkable that the doctor also remembered your daughter's name very specifically and called back. And that's the kind of relationships I think it's so important to be successful. So that was an amazing story. So many lessons to be learned. One thing I wanted to point out was think you have given me a lot of homework here. I might have to go back to this podcast and pull out all those quotes that you have. The unexpected, thoughtful acts.
Yeah, we call them UTAs, unexpected, thoughtful acts. People like thoughtful people.
What do you think a startup should avoid? What are the challenges that you feel might be up ahead for Delta Point going forward in this changing environment? What is top of your mind? Keeps you awake, essentially. Yeah, big loaded question.
No,
Sorry.
it's a very easy question because I've been struggling with this for maybe a year or so because I own the company, and we were sought by a private equity group, and then we had a tragedy, and one of our key employees, for a friend of ours, passed. But I started thinking about how do you get people to want to do business with you? And I came to the conclusion that I had this philosophy: it's if you want your ship to come in, send one out. And what I realized that I had not been sending out any ships. And so then I started saying, okay, well, what else could we do? Because mostly we've been sort of insular as in doing a lot of stuff with pharma. But when I asked people who have the data, let's say we do business with 50 to 75 pharmaceutical companies or medical devices. How many of those are in pharma? The answer was 20,000. And I'm saying, okay, so there's 20,000 people that have pharma, and maybe only half of them have a product or going to have a product, but we're not touching any of them. And then I said, well, what about medical devices? That number's 100,000 in America. There's 100,000. Then if you take veterinarians and say, okay, how many people call on veterinarians? That number's 50,000. So I'm sitting here saying, okay, the first thing I said to myself is that we're going to get destroyed if we don't start using AI. So what I did is I'm in the process right now of basically re-engineering our company so that we have one group that sells my virtual training. And what you do is you get to with my virtual training, you get an opportunity to actually do an objection handling session with a bot. In fact, you can buy all of my virtual training stuff, and I got 4 or 5 different things. I got an assessment on how do you determine whether somebody's going to be really good with a relationship, and we paid for a psychologist to do that. So now what we're going to have here in about the next 2 weeks, we'll be finished. We'll have a part where when somebody finds out about us, they'll be able to call and they'll talk to our bots, and the bots will determine whether they're going to turf them to us because they want a workshop or they want to talk about consulting, or if they just want to buy the virtual training stuff. We've got 6 or 7 or 8 things that they could buy, and any people could do it themselves. I just believed after Christmas last year, because we had a meeting and I had shown them my vision. I didn't know who to hire though. And so I did find the right person to hire, and he's phenomenal. And I think we're going in the right direction. I do think that AI is going to have a ginormous impact on our business, whether that's, doctors or whatever. And so I think that's the key thing. You have to be current, number one. You have to build relationships, and you have to keep studying and reading. You do those 3 things, you'll be in good shape.
What you're doing is pretty advanced. A standalone product based on your experience is going to bring all your experience together into a modern tool. And I really foresee great things for you, Jerry. As we come towards the end of our podcast, I would love to give you 90 seconds pitch time for anything for people who are going to watch this podcast.
I'm rated one of the top sales experts in the world, and I have been for 9 or 10 years. And I've never been below 12, and there's only 30 of them. And so I'm happy about that, but I don't take myself too seriously. I'm just a regular person. I've been blessed by the people that I call my secretary Sunday night. This is my secretary who's 85, and when I was at the pharmaceutical company, she was probably my leader. Now I was probably considered herders. But you can't succeed without other people. You got to build relationships with people, and you got to do right by people, and you can't overcharge people. You got to do what you say you're going to do, when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it. You just have to have integrity. And you also have to be nice to people, really nice to people. And I don't mean gratuitously nice, but I mean, to me, I'm not in it. I come home, I tell people when I speak, and I speak a lot, I got a big old bio, I got a big old bio that makes me look like I know I'm so smart. Now, the first thing I say is, look, let me tell you something. That bio is really impressive. In fact, I actually wrote the thing myself. I said, but I'm going to tell you this. And when I go home tonight, here's what's going to happen when I walk through that door. My wife is going to say, you ain't nothing here. Take out the trip. And so I think it's horrible to take yourself too seriously. Everybody, you can meet people that are far more successful than I am. And it's just not that important. I don't think I want to get wrapped around by myself. I want to be helping people. I want my people to succeed. I want my people to get compensated well when we succeed as a company, and I just want to be a decent person.
I really appreciate your time, Jerry, for that. And thank you very much, Jerry.
I just think if somebody asks you for help, you ought to give it to them. That's what I say. Anybody that asks me to get on a podcast, I'll do it if I can. What else am I going to do? I've already eaten lunch. I'm in pretty good shape. Now I got a TV thing here in about an hour. But nobody wants to see me on television. I do know that. So, Vasa, thank you so much.
I might
really
have to mildly disagree with that. And thank you very much, Jerry. Have a good one.
Thank you.